Okay, I think we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. I'm super excited for this evening's talk, which has been sponsored by the 4D Design Department here at Cranbrook. And I have been following Matt Kenyon's work since 2007 and watched it expand over the years to become even more fantastical and unbelievable with every new piece. And it's been amazing to watch. So I'm always excited to get to share your work with other folks. And it started when I had written a piece about a project that you may show that's called Spore, that is a rubber tree plant that gets automatically watered depending on the Home Depot stock. And it really made me think about how we can use mechanisms in a poetic way to carry messages, and it combined my interest in storytelling with my interest in tinkering and making and mechanisms, and it was just such an exciting moment. And I started thinking about it and had written a piece about an emerging field called device art that was coined by Machiko Kusahara at Waseda University to describe artists who use technology to author message-driven work in limited quantities. And the idea also of blending design and art and thinking about the emergence of devices as poetic carriers of messages. And so I really was excited to bring Matt here, and he's been interacting with the 4D department before. During the pandemic, we had one-on-ones and a lecture as well, because I really think the way that he approaches work is very much part of the ethos of Cranbrook, but really part of the ethos of 4D design as well. So I'm just going to say a few words about which will only capture a fraction of what you're up to. But Matt Kenyon lives and works in Buffalo, New York, where he's associate professor of art at the University of Buffalo, and technology program director of graduate studies, and part of Platform, which is University of Buffalo's socially engaged design studio. His work's been exhibited in many venues, including MoMA, CCCB in Barcelona, MOCAD Detroit, Science Gallery Dublin, and the International Print Center. He's a TED Fellow, so there's some great TED content out there to enjoy, a MacDowell Fellow, and his work's been awarded the FILE Prix Lux. It's been featured in the New York Times, Wired, and Gizmodo, and books such as A Touch of Code and Adversarial Design. And we'll see work from his studio, which goes by Swamp, which you can see here, and I'm sure you'll talk about more, which focuses on critical themes addressing the effects of global corporate operations, mass media and communication, military-industrial complexes, and general meditations on the liminal area between life and artificial life. And I think from there, I'll let you take it away. So thanks for being here, Matt.
Oh, thank you so much, Carla. I've really had a blast the last couple days talking with all of the 4D design students in their studios, and just thank you so much for having me today. There's this quote by punk rock musician and activist Jello Biafra that I really love. He says, "Don't hate the medium, become the medium." And at various different points in my life, in my practice, when I was at a sort of low point or something like this, I would return to this quote as a way of forming a kind of creative resistance. So I'm Matt Kenyon. I'm an artist, and I like to work with media and technology because I'm familiar with them, and I like the power they hold. And I hate them, and I'm afraid of the power they hold. So for the last, over 20 years, I've been operating my studio, which is called Swamp, and it stands for Studies of Work Atmospheres in Mass Production. And I collaborated with Doug Easterly for a number of years, and now I currently run Swamp solo since 2011. So during the pandemic, like a lot of us, maybe watching old movies and trying to keep sane, I kept returning to this classic film, The Invisible Man. And I guess I should say spoiler alert if you haven't seen it. In The Invisible Man, there's this crazy academic who develops this elixir that when he drinks it, it dissolves all of his skin, his hair, his bones, and everything, and he becomes completely invisible. In fact, he's only able to have kind of physical form by wrapping himself in ace bandages and wearing like a rubber nose, wax nose, something like this. And so, it begs the question, like, what would you do if you had this power to be completely invisible? And it's kind of an interesting question to ask, maybe. But unfortunately, what this gentleman does is he starts to conduct systemic acts of terrorism. He, like maybe my favorite scene in the movie, he goes into the bank and lifts up the money box and carries it out into the street and throws it into the street and causes a riot as everyone is trying to get the money. He controls the levers of a train switch station, causes a derailment, a massive train derailment. And he's just an unstoppable force because he's invisible. And it's interesting to think about this as maybe a metaphor for how power operates in our world. It's sort of invisible, pulling on levers that we can see the levers, but the invisible hands sort of causing these derailments and this misalignments of capital and things like that. So the first project I'm going to talk about is a project called Spore 1.1. And this project is a self-contained ecosystem for a rubber tree plant purchased from Home Depot. And Home Depot, as maybe some of you know, has a pretty interesting anti-market evolutionary strategy to put ma-and-pa shops out of business. And one of the things they have is a very liberal return policy. And they have a return policy for their plants even. So if their plant that you buy at Home Depot dies for any reason, you bring its dead carcass back with your receipt and they'll replace it free of charge. And so this enclosure monitors the Home Depot corporate stock value. And so at the end of a week, if the stock goes up, it turns on and activates a tiny little pump and waters the plant. And if it fails to go up, the plant receives no water that week. And what I liked about this piece is that it surprised me. So my expectation was as the company thrived, the plant would thrive. And of course, it's a rubber tree plant, which has this really problematic and rich history connected to colonialism and other rubber trade. And so instead of this one-to-one ratio as the company thrived, the plant was dying more and more often. And what I discovered through this sort of kind of cybernetic contract with the Home Depot stock value by way of this piece is that we were in the middle of a housing bubble, and the American markets were overinflated, and the plant kept dying because the roots were rotten because of overwatering. And it became a kind of poetic kind of message about how living organisms are sophisticated and they cannot be reduced down to a simple graph of growth or something like this. And so back when I made this, the cutting edge technology at the time was Wi-Fi or wireless internet, and all of the sort of onboard computers and pumps and everything like this at the time was quite technically sophisticated and difficult. And I like to think now there's an 8-year-old online on YouTube who could probably show you how to connect, this is before kind of Internet of Things, and to see how the sort of democratization of technology has moved so fast. And now we take it for granted that we have mobile computing and ways of mining and pulling data in real time from markets and environmental sensors and things like that. But at the time that this piece was made, those techniques were not widely used, widely known. So this project kind of became something I like to call like inverse biotelemetry, where instead of like tracking an individual through like radio transponders and where the individual stands in for a group or a herd of a population, this project sort of inverts that, where it takes a kind of pattern from the mini and inflicts it on to this sort of sympathetic character of the individual plant. And the next project I wanted to talk about is called IED, and this is a project that was created in response to the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And so the IED, or my IED, is the improvised empathetic device, whereas the IEDs from a similar period of time were known as the improvised explosive devices. And these used the explosive devices used a small cell phone or pager to activate an ordnance to create a bomb that could be remotely triggered. This project has a similar kind of form factor, but it's triggered by the release of the casualty statistics by the Department of Defense, or CENTCOM. So when the U.S. government essentially released the message of who had died that week, this armband would receive this message and stab me once for each individual who died, and then display the name on a small LCD screen. And what was interesting to me, one of the things that was most interesting to me about this was that I was able to discover patterns in the release of this this casualty information. I found as Fridays would approach, I'd become very anxious because I discovered through this project that the U.S. government tends to release the negative news, like casualty reports, late on Fridays as an effort to avoid the media cycle, because people spend time with their families and things like that on the weekend. And so by internalizing this data through this sort of sharp bit of pain, I was able to discover patterns that I might have overlooked. So this idea of like our bodies as points of resistance and points of pattern and meaning making is extended into several of the projects I'm going to talk about today. And bodies, by bodies, they're not always human bodies in my work. And so maybe some of you recognize this little critter. This is a 3D model animation of a tardigrade or a water bear, or maybe we know them as moss piglets. These are tiny little extrema-tolerant organisms that can grow as large as a half a millimeter, and they live in moss and lichen all over the world. And they've taken these creatures into outer space and exposed them to the vacuum of space, brought them back in, and they've continued their little lives. They can live through extreme environments, tremendous amounts of radiation. They can live in a dehydrated kind of suspended state for 90-something years, and they have a protein that helps protect their genes from radiation in sort of inclement environment. And so as I was working with my collaborator, Doug Easterling, we were thinking about how more and more people's daily activities in the real world were being mediated by this sort of image of themselves, or this kind of avatar in social media and online. Like people were kind of curating their lived environment, their lived lives, as a kind of spectacle that people would passively experience through social media. I thought that the water bear would be a great body to bring into kind of an environment of social media. So this project's called Tardigachi, and it is a enclosure for a single water bear named Stephen. And the enclosure has on one side of it a set of optics that enlarge a tiny little silicon capsule where Stephen, the water bear, lives. And on the other side of the sphere is a 8-bit avatar of Stephen. There's a charging station that charges the battery, and there's also a custom-made pipette that injects tiny little droplets of mossy water into the biological Stephen's capsule in order to sustain his life. This is a little exploded diagram for those of you who like exploded diagrams of how things work. And so I'll just show a little clip I drew of this.
People exist and coexist. It is in their nature to seek objects of desire and to give and share affection. Some forms of affection manifest from other people. Some from food. Some affection is given to the surroundings. And yet another can only be fulfilled by a relationship with a living, non-human creature. This is Walter, and a cat. The cat has been named Agnes, a feline. Agnes is energetic and a loner. At first sight, Agnes does not seem to like Walter. Look at her, scratching, struggling, licking. But look, she wants love and attention. She seeks for objects of desire. She enjoys proximity to other living organisms. She enjoys being close to him. This is Maurice. Maurice is a goldfish. Orange, bulbous, forgetful, being close to him. This is Maurice.
All right.
Maurice is a goldfish.
So, so with Tardigrade, you're able to hold in your hand a sort of biological creature and a digital avatar of this creature. And if you look at the biological Stephen, the little water bear, he's full of ambiguity. Like, you have to kind of project and wonder, like, what must its experience of life be like inside of this little globe? It's difficult to know if Stephen's hungry, tired. It's full of all this rich ambiguity that biological life has. Flip it over, and you have this 8-bit avatar that emotes in a very demonstrative way. It's a caricature of life. And so, in holding it in your hand, you can choose in sort of which side of this you wish to associate with, and think about the sort of interconnections between the sort of biological activities of our life and the sort of virtual avatars that are constructed through the kind of aggregate data of our lives on social media and digital spaces. So switching gears a little bit, the next project I want to talk about is Giant Pool of Money. And Giant Pool of Money is a 15-foot tall champagne glass pyramid surrounded by a set of conveyor belts connected to a custom-made money-splitting change machine. So viewers are encouraged to feed paper money into this machine. It breaks your paper money into coins, dollar into 4 quarters. The quarters are deposited on a series of conveyor belts, which lift the coins up to the very top of the pyramid and deposit them in the top of the pyramid. But what looks like money is actually minted out of gallium, this rare earth element that's used in electronics and thermometers and in a variety of different things. And it melts at human body temperature. And so the coins accumulate at the top of the tower. They're warmed up through a kind of hidden heater, and they liquefy. And when they're in liquid form, gallium looks identical to mercury. And so it activates our kind of toxic our radar for toxic chemicals like mercury. And it also coats the inside of the glass, forming a kind of a really beautiful mirror that reflects the viewers. And as the money, the liquid mercury-esque gallium overflows, it trickles down ever so slightly and then cools and coagulates. And so in that way becomes a kind of critique and parody of these ideas of trickle-down economics or supply-side economics in these mythologies, and in capitalism, that the rising waters lift all boats. It's also very heavy, very precarious and stratified. It ends up being a full coupe glass on top of this pyramid ends up weighing about as much as like a shot put or a small bowling ball. So I'm interested in how this familiar object of money, this kind of familiar symbol, suddenly becomes strange, sort of melts in your hand. And I've been lucky enough to make a series of these giant pool of money. Here's one that I brought to Dublin, Ireland, where there is a block of coins at the top of the pyramid, and I'm using a Bitcoin miner just as a machine to blow a bunch of hot air. And it generated Bitcoin for the gallery, I should say. And we know that Bitcoin mining sort of environmentally unsustainable, uses tons of electricity, generates lots amount of heat. I took a giant pool of money. This is the Japanese version of it, where the 1 yen coin is made out of aluminum, and you can actually float the coins on the surface of water. And gallium, when it comes in contact with aluminum, it destroys it at the molecular lattice level. And so there's a tiny little arrangement, a little pyramid of these floating coins that have a pipette of gallium on top that drips in. And over the duration of the show, the coins degrade and fall to pieces. And floating a currency is like a financial term for often a state actor who's artificially manipulating the value of a nation's currency. So I'm interested in this kind of this idea of money as both like an object and a symbol of a kind of collective belief system. And while I was making Giant Pool of Money, Brexit happened. And at the same time Brexit happened, the UK reissued their £5 note out of a new material. Maybe some of you have seen these. They're sort of polymer money. And there's reasons for doing this, supposedly, like they're more durable. And many countries are sort of rebuilding or reissuing their currency made out of this sort of polymer material. They're pretty amazing, like kind of very strange to feel and to hold in your hand, but you can also use them as a record needle. And so I took a single record from The Clash, Do We Stay or Do We Go? Modified the record so it plays in a loop. I nicked the grooves so that it plays endlessly, and it plays. This is the actual paper vibrating to the sound. when I was teaching at RISD, I ran a research center called, research group called Interventions in Capitalism. And we were one of the sites that we looked at as a way, as a sort of lens of exploring capitalism, was the site of New Bedford as a epicenter of whaling. And of course, we remember that whaling, whale oil was the material that lit cities, lamps. It was a energy source, maybe comparable today to petroleum, except of course it was harvested with these big, beautiful whales. And so at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, they have a giant skeleton, this massive skeleton of a sperm whale. And the skeleton of the whale was prepared in a certain way, kind of an atypical way, in that it is still sort of dripping whale oil for the last several years. So they have a little decanter that's been collecting this sort of whale oil kind of leaching out of the skeleton. And so when you enter the museum, you're sort of hit with this smell, and it's just like a totally far out like idea of this sort of dripping resource, this sort of oil from another time. And I grew up in Louisiana, right in kind of Cancer Row, next to all these oil refineries, and so a kind of connection to a kind of bygone era of this like totally unsustainable harvesting of for an energy resource from these gigantic mammals is pretty far out. And so the next piece I'm going to talk about is called Super Major, and Super Major is a vintage rack of oil cans, and when you approach it in the gallery, the center can has a hole in it, and instead of oil leaking out of this hole, it appears to be flowing drop by drop back into the can. And I like to tell people that this is like a little cheap illusion that points out a larger, much more expensive illusion that these companies, these oil companies, are constantly pulling over on us, that we have to live in a world built around oil and gas extraction. And it points out, it uses a kind of weak spot that we have in our sense perception, where we see, we see reality as a smooth, cohesive set of images, when in reality, in this case, that kind of refresh rate of reality is being sort of manipulated by custom pumps and lighting to create the illusion that this is flowing backwards, slow motion, drip by drip, back into the can. So sometimes when you're making work, sometimes when I'm making work, you wonder about if you're only making work for, who's the audience of the work, and if the work has a potential to cross over from a kind of art and design audience and affect policy. And a few years ago, I was in a group show that traveled to Kuala Lumpur into a gallery in the Petronas Towers in Malaysia. And the Petronas Towers they were built by the Malaysian state oil and gas company. And I couldn't go to the opening. And when I looked online after the opening, I noticed that all of the labels on the can had been removed and replaced by Petronas Corporation oil labels. They had essentially, without my permission, nationalized my sculpture. This is a picture from the opening with a bunch of suits and the cultural ambassador of Ireland, the big, tall, redhead guy. And so I did some interviews with the press, and something interesting happened. At the same time that they nationalized my sculpture, the Malaysian government had been caught in a scandal, that the petrodollar had crashed, and they ran out of money to keep their opposition quiet, and they were exposed in this big corruption scandal. And so at the same time as they were they pulled the piece from the show. There were protests to put it back. And I ended up on a very strange Skype conference call with one of the CEOs of the corporation, a representative from the gallery, where they were threatening me. They were threatening to cut science funding for children if I didn't print a retraction to my comments I had made to the press. And so to this day, I have a Patronus can in all of I have a touring piece of this. It's traveling across the world, and it always has a Patronus can in there, because I said to them, if you wanted so much to be part of the piece, I'll give you what you want. They didn't understand. So another extremophile I'm pretty interested in, I shouldn't call them extremophiles, extreme-tolerant creature, is the petroleum fly. There's this little petroleum fly evolved in the basically like the La Brea tar pits of California. In its sort of maggot state, it evolved to eat animals that fell and got trapped into the oil. And again, this idea of like, we have a lot to learn from biological life and ideas of resilience, as even in the most hostile environment like a tar sand, that there's a tiny little piece of life that has made its home. And this is a project called Puddle. And Puddle, this is Puddle that was installed in MOCAD Detroit, former Cadillac dealership, now in a fantastic art space right up the road from us on Woodward. And they were kind enough to let me jackhammer up a big chunk of the floor and install this art apparatus under the floor and pour a skin coat of concrete over it. And what looks like a puddle of oil, when you approach it over time, tiny words start to appear in the surface of the oil, kind of miraculously. And the words read out as ideas of terms that are related to like Western expansion, First Nations people, natural phenomena, but they're also all sports utility vehicle names. Sequoia, Explorer, Trailblazer. And what looks like oil is actually a puddle of ferrofluid. And there's a gigantic movable type array that lives under the floor that spells out different words and rises up to kiss the bottom of the concrete floor. So how many of you know about the Nielsen system, the rating system? There is a voluntary sort of corporation that has a voluntary sort of self-surveillance aspect to it. So they give you a box that sits on top of your television, and it watches what you watch on television. And people opt into this for a variety of reasons. They call it a kind of a mini America, that where your consumer activity of TV watching helps to predict and exploit commercial rates and things like this. And so they create demographic models of different audiences, and this is used to set ad rates and things like this. And as a subsection of the Nielsen sort of consumer surveillance state, they have a subcategory called the Nielsen home scan system. And so when you become a Nielsen family, they mail you one of these barcode scanners, and they ask you to rescan everything that you buy every day. And then you put it into this cradle, and it radios it up to the Nielsen corporate headquarters, and they aggregate your data and sell it to people. So I became a Nielsen family, me and my dog, and instead of using it as it's intended, I had a hole put into the side of my face, had that hole expanded, and I built the barcode scanner into a custom piece of orthodonture that was installed into the roof of my mouth. And I installed a tiny little video camera into that as well. And instead of recording my individual consumer choices, I went into the shopping spaces of big box retail and the U.S., New Zealand, a bunch of different places. And I created a one-to-one scale map of everything in the shopping space. So I would walk up to an object. The first version of it was grunt activated, so I would grunt and it would shoot this laser barcode out, and I would collect all of this information. I was interested in how the shape of a mouth and the shape of an eye have this kind of symmetry, how your mouth is like this place where you end and the world begins, right? It's a place where you sort of chew up reality and sort of build yourself from it. So this idea that there is a kind of technical language about the economy that is outside of the grasp of most of us led to this project called Cloud. And Cloud is a kind of mobile cart that takes the 10 years rise and fall of a local housing market and compresses it into a 10-minute performance. And the machine creates these little cookie cutter houses out of lighter than air foam, kind of on the fly. And it operates in a couple different ways. I push it around neighborhoods where it acts as a kind of signal device, sending these house-shaped clouds into the air, and they fly for miles, mixing with naturally occurring clouds. I also show it in a gallery where the clouds form a kind of housing estate on the ceiling of the gallery. And over time, they lose their buoyancy and kind of drift back down. And when they land on the floor, they look ashen, hollow, the shells of their previous sort of form, much like houses in many parts of the world now as a result of the global housing crisis. And I'm interested in this idea of patterns, right? We've all laid down and looked up at the clouds and said, like, I see a train or I see a face or something like this. And this idea, like, do patterns exist? Are we forcing them or willing them to exist as we believe in, like, sort of animal spirits of bears and bull markets? Or are we sort of discovering something in this sort of patternless, random economic world? And this piece was selected by the TED Countdown, a kind of project to raise awareness about climate change and the effects on housing. So this project's called TAP, and it is when you approach it in the gallery, it's a sink that's set into the wall of the gallery, and instead of water coming out of the faucet, there's this dark blue flame. And then when you approach it, you hear a voice. You hear voices coming from the faucet, and the sounds are actually coming out of the flame. And so what it is this flame is talking. It's a high voltage plasma speaker. So just like the face of a speaker that moves in space to create sound that we can hear, the expansion and contraction of this high voltage electrical plasma moves in order to create this sound. And the voices are, they range from property owners debating the merits of allowing their land to be mined, to accounts of truck drivers, employed to haul the 2 to 8 million gallons of water needed to frack a single well. And it's people who are contemplating, selling their land because their neighbors sold the land. This sort of complex intersections of conversations related to fracking, which is I think we all know, right? A horizontal mining technology that as an effect of putting a kind of proprietary chemical slurry into water supplies and creates this moment, it's quite terrifying, where natural gas sort of methane sort of comes up through the faucet in people's homes, allowing them to actually light their water on fire. And I started this project when I was living in central Pennsylvania, a site of a great deal of this as a result of the mining of the Marcellus Shale. And the black flame is created by doping the flame with sodium ions and then washing the entire installation in low-pressure sodium lights. And so where the two yellows sort of intersect, it creates this kind of black, this black kind of edged, bluish black edged flame. This is from an installation at the Undercurrent Gallery in Dumbo, Brooklyn from last summer. And the wall behind it's like this big Vanta black wall. So during the pandemic, I also learned to be a bit of a locksmith. And so I started going around my community, meeting with my neighbors, checking in on them, seeing how they're doing. And then we were talking about how important housing was during the pandemic. It was like the difference between life and death, and how many of us are just a paycheck or two away from, housing precarity, like losing it all and being out on the street. So with their permission, I would cut their profile silhouettes into keys. And then I learned to rekey locks in their homes. And so the inside of their homes, inside of the negative space of the security infrastructure of the lock is a negative space of the key. And so when houses change hands, the keys also change hands. And so it sets up a set of circumstances that I'm really interested in. So if somebody is displaced, they lose their home, the next inhabitant is carrying around the previous inhabitant's portrait in their hand, or the bank, the landlord, has a box full of people's faces, profiles, instead of just a box full of keys. And that idea of kind of encoding socially significant information into a everyday object as a form of protest and resistance led to the next project, which is a new project I'm working on called Enough. And so these plastic zip tie handcuffs have become an all too familiar object. Protests, cops using them to arrest people en masse at border crossings and the like. So I figured out a way to take an audio file, a sound, and turn it into the geometry of zip tie handcuffs. So when they're pulled closed, they say the word enough. So a little bit of research I've been looking at, and I was lucky enough to visit this device, the MONIAC, which is known as the National Monetary Income Analog Computer, or the Phillips hydraulic computer. It was created in 1949 by Bill Phillips. And it uses a set of interconnecting valves, tubes, and sort of water bladders, and it uses fluid logic to model the workings of an economy. And so, there's like a tank for taxation, a tank for income, a tank for trade, and things like this. And so before there were digital computers, they were using this to model entire national economies. And so I was interested in how flows of liquids could be used to solve problems and to do calculations. That's something I'm exploring in my studio these days. At the same time I'm doing that research, my family in Louisiana, and this was in 2016, was impacted by this gigantic flood in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And this is the neighborhood I grew up in. So Baton Rouge is not a coastal town, but it experienced this massive cloudburst storm that flooded and displaced thousands of people. And destroyed my family's homes and that sort of thing. And so that led me to the next project I'm going to talk about, which is called Tide. And Tide is another champagne glass tower, but instead of gallium coins inside of each glass, Tide, the glasses are filled with these tiny little sculptures of houses. And these are all individual houses that have been modeled after houses in either Baton Rouge or Buffalo, New York, where I live. And at the top of the ceiling is a data-controlled pump that drips down water. And it's a data-driven pump using data from foreclosure and eviction data, and also intersecting with climate change information. And as the glasses fill up, the houses become invisible. They've been made out of a material that has the same refractive index as the liquid that's dripping down. And it's incredibly fragile, like our social system that we're all experiencing. And as they shift from being visible to invisible, I think of it as like a kind of centerpiece for a series of stories about the precarity that we experience as a result of housing and climate, the intersection of housing and climate crisis. So sometimes you can see maybe just a tiny little roof line, very similar to the tiny little roof line that you could see as a result of the flood. And that invisibility sort of mirrors the feelings of invisibility that members of the community felt as the media lens moved on very quickly, chasing the next gigantic climate change and economic disaster. And the material that the houses are made out of is actually a kind of reformulation of a silicon material that's used in industrial solar industry to protect, to weather protect solar cells, that are out in the world. And turns out you can kind of dial that refractive index of those silicons in very precisely now. And of course, right, when someone owes more on their house than it's worth, people say it's underwater. And that term is both figurative and literal at this point. So the next few works I'm going to talk about relate to the notions of invisibility and visibility. So back during the Iraq War, Donald Rumsfeld did this interview where he said, in response to a question on Fox News, why don't we keep track of the civilian casualties as a result of our invasion? Rumsfeld said, well, we don't do body counts on other people, which was, I thought, insensitive, and it turns out like a flat-out lie, because as a result of the leaking of the Iraq war logs, we found out that they were, in fact, keeping track of this information. And I come from a veteran family, and both my dad and my stepfather were in the American War in Vietnam. And so the Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial was a sculpture and a work that had a big presence in my life. And if those of you have visited the memorial, you know that as you approach the stone to read the names, it's polished, and you're also kind of confront your own image and the reflection of the names of those who've been lost. But of course, it's incredibly one-sided, right? It only is a record of like our side, its casualties. And in response to that, that led me to create Notepad. And Notepad looks like an everyday yellow legal tablet of paper, but all of the lines in the paper are microprinted text, and they contain the details of individual Iraqi civilians that died as a result of the US invasion. This printmaking technique called microtext is a technique of printing that's normally reserved for printing currency and counterfeit protecting legal documents like checks. So those of you who still use checkbooks, often when you, if you look very closely at the signature line that you sign on your check, it often is a microprinted line that is the name, states the name of your bank or credit union. So I repurposed this printing technique to make these tablets. And then I set about smuggling hundreds of them into the stationary supply of the US government and the coalition governments, putting it under the noses of the politicians who voted to authorize use of force. And then I started to give the paper out. And so I have a project where I give the paper out. I have some paper I can share with you at the end of my talk. And I encourage people to write letters to members of government, to presidential libraries, and help smuggle this this unacknowledged civilian body count data into the official government archives. And several years after the Bush administration, the sort of criminals left office, I thought, well, maybe if I ever have an opportunity to meet current members or former members of government, I'll share the project with them and ask them what they think of it. And oddly enough, I, a few years ago, ended up at the Chautauqua Institute the same time I was giving a talk right after. May I give this to you? This is a special legal tablet. It's Alberto
actually
Gonzalez.
part of an ongoing art project.
The
This is a
Richard Memo
special
author.
Yes, and
the
I know
Bush
you won't believe me,
administration.
but it's in
Former
the collection
Attorney
of the
General.
Museum of Modern Art. I'm an artist.
Okay.
And all of the lines of the paper are actually,
Are they going to disappear?
no, they're microprinted text that contain the names of individual Iraqi civilians who have died since the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
so,
Thank you. Thank you.
So right after that, his men sort of not so politely escorted me away from the kind of green room behind the stage. So other politicians, foreign politicians, have been a little bit more interested in the project than old Alberto Gonzalez. Yeah, so I have some of that I can share with you. The next project uses the same kind of microprinting technique, but it is a project called Alternative Rule, and I believe many of you have a sheet of this we handed out at the door. These lines are microprinted texts that contain details of U.S. school children who've been killed or injured in gun violence, starting with the Columbine shooting to approximately the present. And when Emma Gonzalez gave this amazing speech where she called BS on the politicians who were calling, sharing their thoughts and prayers following a recent school shooting, right? I thought about the microprint as a kind of anti-BS technology. And so I've been sharing this paper with activists and they're using the paper to write letters to advocate for gun reform and a stop of this nonsense where so many school children being killed and injured by out of control gun culture in America. And so you can use this paper I gave you today. And if you would like more, you have a community group that would like to have a letter writing campaign, you can just contact me through my website, and I ship the paper out all over the country, all over the world. And during COVID, I created this project called Log Rule, and it uses logarithmic paper, the form of a logarithmic paper, but all of the lines on the paper, again, are microprinted text and contain over 10,000 individual names and details of individuals that died as a result of COVID-19, SARS-CoV-19. And the logarithmic paper is an interesting form. It's paper that's used by engineers and data scientists to chart information that has exponential growth, like the spread of a virus. And these are installed with video enlargers so that individuals and groups of individuals can honor the individual lives lost by reading them together. So back to The Invisible Man. At the end of the film, the police and townspeople are at a loss about how to stop this invisible menace. He's able to assassinate witnesses, and he just seems like an unstoppable force. And in the end, it's the freshly fallen snow that provides a solution. One person keenly observes footprints in the snow, and they are able to take aim and shoot him. And so my studio practice, I like to think, seeks to kind of outline these invisible power structures, just like the snow in the film, so that collectively we can all take aim and take them down. Thank you. Questions? Yeah.
Predominantly like technology to realize all of these like political projects, but I guess like the technology is always evolving, or like you're kind of like using it as a magic trick to achieve your goals. Like I don't know, can you speak to that a little, I guess, or like why do you feel the need to use technology? Like what would these works be? I mean, I suppose some of them are very lo-fi, but yeah.
Yeah, I think like the range, it's like a range from like subtle nuance to maybe like obnoxious spectacle, right?
Yeah.
And